All right. Well, here we are at 7:01, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone again, and thanks for joining us. We've got folks saying hello and introducing themselves in the chat box, so we will use that chat box to moderate conversations, and you can ask questions and make comments, and we'll keep track of those along the way as we go into the Q&A. So we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Laura Nelson. I'm the project leader for the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance. Again, welcome and thanks for joining us. Some of you are familiar faces and some of you are not, so I want to just share a quick introduction about who the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance is. We're a rancher-led conservation organization based in Malta, Montana. We've been around for about 17 years, and our origin story centers around about 30 ranch families in South Phillips County who gathered together to solve common problems. And today our mission statement is ranching, conservation, and communities, a winning team. And we really believe that those three things, when we work together, we are a winning team. We exist to help multi-generational and beginning ranchers build the collaborative, trusting relationships and community-driven solutions that we need to create healthy working landscapes in a vibrant rural community. At Ranchers Stewardship Alliance, we believe that ranchers can feed the world, that together we can preserve our prairie neighborhood, and that ultimately our goal is to nurture the next generation. And one of the ways that we do that is to host educational events. One of the core values of our leadership and our board is that we are always learning, that we always have more to learn and we have room to grow, and that we want to be a conduit to help others do the same. So with that, that's my quick spiel about the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance. If you want to learn more about us, you can go to ranchstewards.org. But along those lines of being committed to education, this is the first of our Rural Resilience Seminar. So we're going to be hosting these kinds of gatherings the third Thursday of every month, or excuse me, the third Tuesday of every month, starting this month. And that will go through May right now. So we'd sure invite you to register for the rest of those seminars as well. We're going to have Chris Munsick and Nicole Masters talking about soil health, and Dallas Mount talking about cell grazing, and then our own Leo Barthelmess and Todd Parker talking about virtual fencing, virtual livestock fencing. So we are just really excited to be hosting this seminar. So again, that's my introduction. Dave just started his 21st year as a professor in the wildlife biology program at the University of Montana. For more than a decade, he has served as science advisor to the Natural Resource Conservation Service, providing science support for Farm Bill conservation programs. As science advisor, Dave's work has resulted in voluntary conservation being implemented on millions of acres across the West, unprecedented conservation partnerships, and the withdrawal of the greater sage grouse as a candidate species on the endangered species list. He continues to provide science support to the NRCS, launching new initiatives to increase conservation on private lands. Dave has a special place in his heart for the Highline, and he says he's excited to be with us tonight, but we're really excited that he's with us tonight. So thanks, Dave, and we'll go ahead and let you take it from here.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Dave Naugle coming to you live from, well, our spare bedroom in Missoula. Sorry about Zoom. My colleagues remind me often that I have a face for radio. But seriously, I'm honored to kick off your seminar series tonight with special thanks to Laura for her vision and logistics in putting this series together, to Marissa Sather with Fish and Wildlife Partners Program for the invitation, Kyle Tackett with NRCS out of Dillon for ongoing CRP conversations, and Matt Jones right here at for the spatial analyses I'll present here tonight. I want to start this evening, though, by first showing participants what real private lands leadership looks like in rangelands conservation. And here they are. Hats off to the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance as the recipient of the 2020 Fish and Wildlife Service Regional Directors Award for Excellence. Your insights, experience, dedication are what makes the Highline a special place. I'm continuously fascinated by most conservationists' almost singular focus on public lands, when in fact, private working range lands are the glue that holds together these large and intact grasslands. When you peel it all back, the same ranches that sustain our rural communities are also the most productive lands for wildlife. Aldo Leopold, the father of modern conservation, wrote back in the 1930s that, quote, conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding the private landowners who conserve the public interest. And of course, this still rings true today. Science, including my own, has taken 20 years to catch up to RSA's mission. Now more than ever, academics are co-producing science with stakeholders so that findings contribute to better conservation outcomes. I submit it as evidence our newest study. In the past, we would have quantified the habitat needs of each high-profile species in the highline. Today, we think more holistically by showing intact rangelands as the best predictor for achieving multi-species conservation. And next generation seeds are being planted. For example, universities one day, I'm confident, will be teaching private lands conservation in our mainstream curriculums. Degree requirements could include an internship where students for a summer live on a working ranch like yours to learn to think more like their future clientele. So don't give up on us academics as we continue to learn from you guys each day. So here's your fun fact for the evening. Rangelands cover a third of the nation shown here in green, of which 2/3 are privately owned and stewarded. Rangelands conservation is entering a long-awaited period of growth. Think about this for a moment. A renaissance, if you will. The media is communicating the importance of private lands conservation like never before. Producer-centric organizations like yours are forming all over the West. And new resources are becoming available so that rancher alliances can organize themselves. As this renaissance takes shape, it will be incumbent upon us all to innovate big enough and fast enough to meet the challenge. As NRCS's science advisor for Working Lands for Wildlife, under which the Sage Grouse Initiative falls, I'm happy to report to you tonight that USDA is doing its share going into the future. As a sneak peek, I show you on the left here that in about a month, the agency is going to release its new framework for conservation action in the sagebrush biome, essentially re-upping our commitment for another 2 million acres of private lands grazing conservation. But maybe more importantly is that we're picking up lessons learned from a decade in the sagebrush biome and moving it farther east into the Great Plains, where we plan to be more intentional and scale up conservation of Great Plains grasslands. If you go to a Google screen, click on images and type in a simple search like rangeland monitoring, this is what comes up. Many pictures of under our boots, quadrat, couple of square meter scale monitoring of rangelands. If we are going to scale up rangeland conservation in the future and work on these biome scales, we must embrace 21st century technology to up our game. So tonight, I'm pleased to give you a quick tour of RAP, or the Rangeland Analysis Platform, created right here at the University of Montana for revolutionizing rangeland monitoring. So if you're at home watching, you're holding your smartphone, you can type in rangelands.app. It's free, it's online with land management data at our fingertips now. I want to show you a couple things tonight. It's both the rangeland vegetation cover and the herbaceous production layer that's now available to us from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean, covering all of our nation's western rangelands. We won't go into great detail, but a few comments on how RAP was created. So every 16 days, there's satellites zipping around our atmosphere, snapping pictures of land cover. And in that every 2-week period, we get a full look at land cover across the globe. We then use artificial AI software to train that satellite imagery using 58,000 NRI and AIM plots, those quadrats of real data that we're taking on the ground. So if you've ever participated there in AIM or NRI, thank you, because we use that data extensively. And then thirdly, we have tremendous relationships with Google to both use their computing power and their server farms to be able to do this speed and number of calculations efficiently. And so today you can go on RAP, and we have created the 5 vegetative coverages that everybody uses for rangeland planning and conservation: deep-rooted perennials, annuals, shrubs, a bare ground layer, and a tree layer. So I wanted to make this real for the audience. So we pulled a BLM allotment out in the high line where we chased down a 2002 and a 2010 photo. And so you can visually see the change here in deep-rooted perennials. And so if you put that polygon into RAP and hit calculate, this is the graphic that comes up. So the y-axis up and down here is change in cover. The green line is deep-rooted perennials, and you can see the black boxes from 2002 to 2010, with a cover increase in perennials from 40 almost up to 60% cover, with a concomitant decrease in bare ground, shown here in the orange line. The rangeland analysis platform isn't just vegetation cover, but it's also production measured for that vegetation in pounds per acre. And I know this is new to some folks hearing it for the first time tonight. Remember, it's not just a snapshot in time, it's also from the mid-80s up through present. So we have time and space for rangelands at this geographic extent. Let's revisit that BLM allotment again. So from 2002 to 2010, again, you upload that polygon in RAP, hit calculate, and this graphic comes up. But this is for productivity, with the y-axis being biomass in pounds per acre. For that same allotment and that same time period, you can see that pounds per acre for deep-rooted perennials increased from 600 to almost 1,000 pounds. And so RAP is relevant from a rangeland monitoring and assessment perspective at a 30-meter area, which is about the size of the infield of a baseball field, the sandy part with the bases, a pasture, a BLM allotment, a county, regional assessments, or as I'm going to show you next, using monitoring in time and space over the western half of the US. So I don't want to just talk about data tonight. I also want to talk about wrap in action and show you applications. And so I want to do two things. The first one, I'd like to take us out to the Great Plains and show wrap and science in support of the Great Plains framework that will be coming out soon. And then secondly, I'd like to come back to Valley County in your backyard and use wrap to talk a little bit about expiring conservation reserve program grasslands. So first, jump in the truck and we head out to the Great Plains. This shows the tree cover layer in wrap for the western half of the nation. Increasing tree cover is shown in green with the darkest green shades for the highest tree cover. And so when you look at places like Texas, eastern Oklahoma, Kansas, up into Nebraska and South Dakota, even some of our biggest grasslands, globally recognized like the sandhills, we now have trees invading those prairies, such as red cedar. For years, grassland conservationists have focused on agricultural conversion. The best data set is called plow print. And so we focused heavily, we annually track grasslands that have been lost to cropland acres. But with wrap calculating tree cover expansion, we see that we have sort of missed half of the story. And so shown here on the left is tree cover expansion in acres over time, the same time period from which the most recent plow print estimates. And here you look and you go, oh my gosh, the rate of grassland loss to woodland expansion is almost equivalent to cultivation in the Great Plains. I'll say it one more time because it still resonates with me after working with wrap. Rate of grassland loss to woodland expansion is equivalent to cultivation in the Great Plains. We've sort of been missing half the story. I think if you live in those landscapes, you're very aware of it. But from a larger conservation story, I think this point still has to be made. Of course, from a ranching perspective, livestock production plummets. Shown here is the 80% historical stocking rate decline that occurs as you move into higher coverages of juniper, 15 to 30% juniper cover, all the way up to 50% woodland cover, which was grazing forage in the past. So let me take you out to a place called the Luss Hills in the Great Plains of Nebraska. And I want to show you a couple photos starting here on the left, where this chunk of grazing lands in 1992 was essentially tree-free and highly productive forage. Fast forward just to 2018, and in the absence of fire, all of that black area is red cedar that has moved in, and under each of those cedars is black dirt, almost a complete loss of forage production in just a 25 to 30 year period. Really hard to run an operation under that type of limited grazing potential. So here's what we're doing then with wrap and the production layer. So on the left-hand side, the blue line is production of that chunk of the Luss Hills before trees moved in. And then the red line below it that starts to diverge through time is the decreased production once trees cover the landscape. That gray area, the difference between highly productive and less productive, is coined yield gap. Yield gap is a really common principle in the cropping industry. Boy, if you experience, where I grew up in Iowa, a 1% yield yield gap in corn production, you stop the show and you fix it and you gain back that yield gap. Yield gap is still a new concept in rangelands. But now that we have RAP and we can calculate that, we can show for the entire Great Plains where yield gap is costing a ranching community lost production, and color that up like the right side of the graphic here in red. If you then use RAP and you pan way back out to the Great Plains and you monetize yield gap for the entire area, so far, just since the 1980s, the grazing industry has lost about $5 billion as a result of tree expansion. Having this kind of data at our fingertips can benefit those grazing communities and show them where to engender that conservation partnership to bring fire back into that system and start removing red cedars to retrieve and bring that productivity back to their bottom line.
You want to cover the...
Okay, so I've been throwing a lot at you, I know. So quick time out here. Let's switch gears now and move back into your backyard into Highline of Montana and Valley in Phillips County. So here's a different slide of sort of RAP in action. This time in the upper graphic, what we're showing is production on the Highline. And then I've circled Valley and Phillips County in yellow. So everywhere that's green has experienced a 30-year positive trend in rangeland production since the mid-80s. Anywhere that's red has been a decline. And so in the lower graphic, you can see that perennial forb and grass cover, shaded in green, has remained fairly constant through time, but the production of those deep-rooted perennials has increased. And in Valley and Phillips County, it's increased by about 40%. So let's think about expiring conservation reserve program fields. There's about, in Valley County, there's about 500 units that were previously broken out, enrolled in CRP, with contracts that are now expiring anywhere from now to 2023. If you add up the acreage of those CRP units, it totals about 43,000 acres. And so we took each one of those CRP polygons, overlaid them in RAP on the production layer, and can show producers that the average annual production of those is anywhere from 750 to 2,000 pounds per acre. And then graphically displayed on the left, you can see the smaller dots in lighter green are about 750 to 1,000 pounds, all the way up to the biggest circles with the darkest color that are tipping the scales at almost 2,000 pounds per acre. So then we did a little bit of math to show the value of these expiring CRP fields to the community. And so the idea here is, could we take expiring CRP fields and keep them in grass, but transition them away from set-aside CRP and into valued components of your grazing operation? And so we looked at Valley County CRP fields, which average 0.32 to 0.48 AUMs per acre. And then the Valley County Soil Survey estimates 0.3 to 0.51 AUMs per acre. And so an annual rental rate for CRP at 950 pounds per AUM at a 25% grazing efficiency for 30,000 acres would equate to a rental revenue annually of about $500,000. So it's back of the napkin. I am not a rancher, and boy, I do not. I'm just trying to get folks close to see the value of these if they were put into a grazing operation. So then we flip over and think about, well, what's the value of those lands if they stay in grass instead of revert back to something like a dryland wheat field? And so here I'm showing in orange. If you're not from this neck of the woods, these are some of our long-term research sites. And the orange area is the pathway of the longest sage grouse migration in the world. And so it comes from southern Canada, goes down through Valley County. Some years in really bad heavy snows, those birds will jump the Missouri River, but then they always return right back up that flyway, show up at the same leks and breed there again in the spring. The blue background is the migratory pronghorn pathways. Now, this is the longest pronghorn migration also known. You hear a lot about path of the pronghorn in Wyoming. It's been talked a little bit more in the media, but this one is actually longer. And so from a wildlife perspective, these CRP lands, when coupled with other aspects of your grazing operation, Bitter Creek wilderness, how it all ties together in this massive intact grassland, supports amazing wildlife conservation. If you guys remember back to Joe Smith, he was a PhD student here at the University of Montana. He did a lot of radiomark sage grouse work, and he looked at the impact of cultivation on that particular critter and showed that a single square mile of cropland in an otherwise sea of grass can negatively impact sage grouse in a landscape 12 times that size. And so if you multiply 12 by that 42,000 acres of potential cultivation with outgoing conservation reserve program, we could reduce habitat quality in Valley County on the scale of 500,000 acres. And so I do worry if these world-class wildlife migrations could withstand that type of fragmentation. So in closing tonight, we've found through the Sage Grouse Initiative and other Farm Bill programs that our MO for a decade still rings true today. It's wildlife conservation through sustainable ranching. And that early investments in ranching communities like RSA almost always result in a domino effect of beneficial outcomes. And so if we can find a way to transition these CRP fields into working grazing lands, it has the potential to make room for young new ranching families, $500,000 in annual revenue to the community. It certainly keeps these large grasslands intact and will conserve the migratory pathways of critters like pronghorn and sage grouse. With that, I'll turn it back to Laura to discuss the logistics of the breakout rooms.
All right, great. Thanks, Dave. That's a lot of information, a lot of really good information. And we want to give you guys a chance to kind of discuss that with some of the other audience members. Again, as we were watching our registrations come in, we're watching ranchers, landowners, agency, NGO, all sorts of experts in your own fields. And so we want to have some time for you guys to share some ideas. So we're going to go into breakout rooms. Angel is going to cue those up. And so you're going to be kicked into breakout rooms of 5 to 7 other people, and we'll have you for 5 minutes. You'll go around the room, introduce yourself, tell each other where you're from and what you do, and then we'll start with the first discussion on the RAP, the Rangeland analysis platform. And we have a question posed: what rangeland monitoring information is most useful to your operation? That could be your business or your ranch, or some other topic. Of any other comments or thoughts that you'd like folks to discuss or be thinking about as we go into those breakout rooms?
In the RAP discussion, I would throw out there that it's new, hasn't been around for very long. The U.S. Department of Agriculture just provided the resources necessary for the University of Montana to hire what we're calling a RAP outreach coordinator. And so literally the desired applicant just accepted that position and is going to show up here in about a week. And so if there are groups that go, this is interesting, of course, I want to know more about it and see what types of applications might be useful to me, we'll actually have a person that can do trainings and that type of thing. And so I see on RSA's spring seminar, you guys have a book club where you're reading soil health. Yeah, it's just a really interactive group. If you guys would want any additional RAP training or anything like that, boy, we would jump to do that and learn as much from you as you're learning from us.
It's even better than every 45 days. It's every 16 days. And so we provide estimates of biomass or production every 16 days, and that includes real time. In fact, today I was just working on getting going on 2021. So if you go to the RAP right now, you can look at biomass estimates every 16 days from the 1980s all the way to December 31st, 2020. And so it does provide that kind of near real-time estimate. So it allows you to see how things are changing during the season. But most importantly, it allows you to see how things have changed during the season across multiple seasons. So you can go back and look, what was things like in the early 2000s? And were things greening up sooner? Were they senescing sooner? How has things changed from 20 years ago to now? So it allows you to do all of that.
Brady, another question specific to the RAP: is the production and yield gap data being built into the available RAP layers?
So currently it is not as an available layer. That is still kind of it's a finished product, but it's literally the stuff that Dave showed you tonight. It's hot off the press. And so we're still working on that, and we will make it available in one form or another. So be on the lookout for that.
Okay, another RAP specific question: can RAP also track yield gap of brush, as in mesquite, etc., encroachment into grasslands?
So yes, it can. The analysis that Dave showed tonight, however, was just focused on trees. But that same framework can be applied to brush and creosote or mesquite, specifically there in the desert Southwest. I grew up in southern New Mexico, and so I'm very, very familiar with that type of vegetation. And so that same framework can be applied for brush and herbaceous production, and it's something that we are going to consider and look into in the future, and hopefully make that available.
Great. Okay, do you see RAP being used to quantify cover percentage down to species, or at least warm and cool seasons?
That's a great question, and it's one we get a lot. And so right now it cannot do that. It cannot do species level composition. And that's because you've got to remember that we're looking at the Earth from hundreds of miles above the Earth out in space. And to get down to species level composition, it's a hard thing to do. It's really hard to do it well. And so what we did is we backed up and we said, we're going to focus on these 5 functional groups: perennials, annuals, shrubs, trees, and bare ground. Why? Because those are functional groups that we can do well, and they're groups that are used a lot in rangeland planning, in rangeland monitoring. They're relevant groups. If I had to add one more set of groups to that, I would definitely add warm season versus cool season grasses. And that's something we're kind of actively thinking about and trying to figure out how can we best do that. So maybe in the future, that might be something we'll add to it.
Great. And then there's another, there were several questions, and maybe we can have a combination of different folks if anybody wants to chime in here. Or Brady, maybe you're still the guy on the hot spot. But there were several different questions around the application for noxious weeds. How do we use RAP in dealing with noxious weeds, identification, these kinds of things? What's the connection there? Monitoring and treatment effects.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the first thing I'd like to say is, keep in mind that RAP is just one tool in the toolbox. We have lots of tools that we can use for management. And RAP and satellite data sets, remotely sensed data sets, they aren't going to replace our other tools. It's not going to replace the data that we collect ourselves. It's not going to replace the intimate knowledge that we have of the landscapes by working or living in an area our entire lives or for a long time. It's just meant to complement that and to go alongside that. And so when it specifically comes to noxious weeds, invasive plants, because of those functional groups, RAP can't specifically identify, your favorite invasive weed, whether it's Sericea lespedeza in the Southern Great Plains or whether it's cheatgrass in the Western rangelands. It can't pinpoint it precisely. But what it can do is it can help provide a broader and bigger picture of what's going on in the landscape. And so if your problem is annual grasses, you can see what are annual grasses doing across my watershed, across my county, across the landscape that I'm invested in. And so I encourage everyone to think about how does RAP fit into your broader toolbox of rangeland management? How can it help you accomplish the objectives that you would like to accomplish?
Hey, Laura, this is Naugle again. I'll jump in there. In the new soon to be released sagebrush biome framework, RAP, the annuals layer that Brady speaks of, is being used extensively and has been embraced by the Western Governors Association and coined the cheatgrass challenge. And so cheatgrass, as you guys know, invades Western ranching communities, results in catastrophic wildfire with that nasty feedback loop. And so they've used the annuals layer along with a sea change in philosophy, where we used to go into areas that were heavily infested with cheatgrass, invest, but we just keep fighting losing battles. Now the bumper sticker is conserve the core and then grow the core. And so they used the annuals layer of RAP and have identified these large intact grazing landscapes that aren't infested yet. And they aim to keep them that way and then to grow those cores by fighting the annuals battle around the edges. And so it's a whole new way of thinking that came about when you get these big picture views of rangelands in time and space.
Well, so we have one more question focused on RAP, and then we're going to move into, we have a slew of questions about the idea of converting CRP to working grazing lands. But I think this is a great one to end and transition us. What is the most useful way to use RAP as a cattle producer?
I would love to hear what other people think on this. And so if you have ideas, when I'm done talking, I'll put my email in the chat box, and please email me and tell me how you're using RAP as a producer, because I would love to know. I think one of the best things that it does is kind of hints at what Dave was talking about. It helps provide context for what's going on the ranch, in the watershed, in the region that you're working. It provides that context in space, across space, but it also provides that context in time. And so we can see how things have changed. And so I've worked with many producers that when they've implemented treatments or management plans, you know, back in the late 80s or the early 90s, they wanted to see what difference did it make? Did it work? And sometimes they have data, sometimes they don't. But the RAP allows us to kind of fill in those gaps and see, you know, it allows us to evaluate how is our management working. And as I said before, you know, you plug it alongside the local knowledge and expertise you have, and then you evaluate and you make the best decision going forward. And so I think the most powerful thing that it provides is that context. It helps fill in the data, but it also helps us think spatially across space and time.
Any other thoughts on that, Dave or Martin?
Yeah, I would add one very specific example we had just this week. So we've been working with a producer that has conifer encroachment problems, and had kind of known that his trees were increasing through time. They come to us with a concern about it, and we ran it through RAP last week and had the printouts for him. And when he last showed up to visit with us, we went through kind of his timeline of what he had thought had happened, and I had him kind of explain through the changes that had happened in the last 20 years on his ranch. And he talked about, with this ranch being mostly BLM, they had a bunch of changes to their BLM grazing happen in the early 90s. And then in Northeast Montana since 2010, we've had at least 100% moisture almost every year since then. And he said that he really thought from 2010 forward, that's when his trees really took off. And then I showed him the graphs from the RAP tool, and it showed in the late 80s, his bare ground being around 15% and his perennial being more like 40% or less. And within 5 years after his BLM grazing changes to where they were doing more rotation and a little more rest of kind of their summer pastures, it was showing that their perennial vegetation increased by 10% and their bare ground directly went down by 10%. And then we went along further, and it showed as of 2010, the trees started taking off. They had been around 4% for 30 years. And in the last 10, they had climbed from 4% to 12. And it also showed that he'd lost over 20% production in his perennials in that same time. And that what had replaced it was trees and then also annual grasses. We have a lot of Japanese brome here that can be an issue in South Phillips. And he had noticed all that, and he took that graph from me, looked at it, and he's like, there, I knew I wasn't crazy. And he went home with it. And we were out there today, and he still had it on the kitchen table.
So a great way to quantify on the ground knowledge and experience. Yes. Sounds like that's really cool. Well, we're a little bit past the 8 o'clock hour, but if you want to stick with us, we've got a lot of great questions about the CRP issue. So we're going to keep asking those questions and try to keep this moving along and get those answered. Maybe probably the biggest bucket of questions, if you will, kind of all fall under this idea of how to manage crested wheatgrass, how to get other plant species to grow with crested wheat, monocultures of crested wheat to native successes. So we've got a lot of questions about what do we do with managing crested wheatgrass to optimize grazing value. And Martin, can you take a stab at answering that?
Sure. I know at least locally here, Marissa has tried a bunch of different trials of things that have worked to try and get rid of or at least reduce crested. And we worked with some producers like Dale, as part of the RSA board, that have worked to at least try to include more plants into their crested. But what we're finding over and over again is you never actually get rid of it. You can reduce it. We've had people have luck, kind of the old tried and true CRP renovation method of basically spray it out for 3 years with kind of a complete replanting of some fairly aggressive plants, basically to try and beat that seeding stage out, that have had pretty good success. I want to say Dale told me once that he felt pretty good if he had a 10% increase in plants when he just planted into crested. And with that spray out and a couple year basically break of crested and putting more either cover crops or even grain production for a minute, for a couple years into it. We've seen some better results there. We're cut that crested from 90+% down to usually around 10. But no, it's really hard to do, and we haven't seen a lot of methods that are successful every time. There's a lot of things that work sometimes, and in some places that conditions the next year don't favor. So that is absolutely the hardest thing we have to do up here, is increasing diversity in crested. But we do have a ton of interest in it, so we're definitely trying to find ways to do that.
Great. We'd love to hear any comments or notes from other folks out in the audience into the chat box of thoughts or experiences you've had with that as well. Again, that's the kind of the largest umbrella of topics that we had on questions under the CRP topic is dealing with crested wheatgrass. Another big topic that I see in comment on a lot of these questions is funding. As I understand, fencing can be a limiting factor for CRP land. Are there pilot projects we can get off the ground or are occurring to help with the economics of getting these lands into grazing systems? So there's just a lot of needs, lots of help. We need lots more money to help convert and keep CRP and grazing and wildlife habitat. Lots of questions and comments on that. If Dave, Martin, any of you'd like to share some thoughts there.
Sure, I'd start with in this new Sage Grouse Initiative framework, that's definitely kind of an increased priority and option, is that slowing down that grassland conversion, which I think is going to open up more options for those types of projects. And then here specifically, I mean, we have almost every interested partner you could dream of that is working towards some sort of grassland type program like this. So through like RSA and the Conservation Committee, we try to basically compile different project funding sources and make those available to producers that are interested. The issue becomes a lot of CRP is very small acreage and usually independently owned. So it's a lot of miles of border fencing for very few acres of impact. So basically the cost per acre is fairly high compared to, say, other projects we might be looking for funding for. And then another issue I think is just exposure and availability. If we let 15 people know we only have enough money for 10, if we only let 2 people know we have enough money for 15, and we're low on interest for a year, but the timing seems to struggle, but we've never had an issue of finding projects that are looking for that. Then that becomes another issue. We could spend every dollar of conservation funding that comes into this landscape on that grassland retention and that basically introduced grass management. And we wouldn't be able to do anything else too. So it becomes kind of balancing other conservation needs too. That becomes an issue for us here.
Dave, do you have anything you want to add there?
A couple things. I mean, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation did provide resources to RSA that RSA's now through private fundraising has matched. And then NRCS just finalized funding of a TIP, which is a targeted implementation plan. And Valley County was actually selected as the pilot because of you guys' leadership to take a stab at some of these new innovative ways to transition CRP into working lands. And so, yeah, it was part of kind of why I picked that as one of the topics tonight, that not every crested questions can be answered. We don't have the full funding, but I would say that people are looking to RSA and Valley County leadership to help figure this stuff out. If anybody can do it, it's going to be you guys. And then I would say that I see some questions hinting around CRP in the Great Plains, and a couple of comments there. There was some brand new work funded by the Farm Service Agency by Virginia Tech that went and surveyed hundreds and hundreds of landowners in the Great Plains and found that only about 55% of them because of lower soil rental rates, varying caps in CRP acreage that's available. Only about 55% of them are getting CRP renewed. And so sort of in our group, we've been thinking about not necessarily trying to retarget CRP because there's so many different groups in the Farm Bill trying to do that. We thought of this transitioning on the back end into working lands as maybe a solution to that. We also just finished an analysis of the Southern Great Plains, 5 of those states, that shows instead of trying to go and transition CRP in the most productive areas, landowner surveys indicate that there's places that were broken out and put into CRP where if they had a little bit of help to transition, as many as 75 to 80% of those landowners would keep that in grass. So there's also a thought process in all of this where my guess is when that comes out of CRP in those most productive lands, those are probably croplands. But if we can put back together the places where there was some breakout, but maybe a little bit of remorse for doing that, and there's still a ranching culture there, and a place where neighbors can share equipment, that's that social fabric where the grazing is still accepted. We're probably going to have our most success there. And I don't think that's how maybe most people are thinking about that right now.
And maybe this would be a good time, Martin, if you could explain a little bit how the RSA Conservation Committee works, how we've used that system to kind of pool resources and fund some of these projects. Again, I'm seeing a couple more questions about how do folks afford infrastructure development to support CRP, grazing, and those kinds of things. Could you share a little bit about how that model works?
Sure. So the RSA Conservation Committee basically exists as a hub of conservation groups, agencies, interested landowners, and people involved with the Rancher Stewardship Alliance, basically to expand the effectiveness and overall footprint of conservation that happens in this area. Being a large intact grassland, we get a lot of agency and outside nonprofit group focus on what's happening here as far as conservation action. So we work to basically kind of organize all of that interest and exist as a panel basically where people that are working with landowners on projects can produce or present projects to the group and basically receive feedback on either additions or subtractions from the project, other ways to fund it, basically a long list of have you thought about can be relayed back to that person or that landowner. So we can take a project where somebody's interested in taking their 640 acres of CRP and putting a border fence and stock water on it. And we can look at it as a group and know that, say, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has a program and the person involved is very interested in working with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. We can take that project and send it to FWP and let them handle it through their programs. We can take a similar project again and know that like NRCS has a program available and has the experience and ability to be very, very good at stock water. We can send them to NRCS for stock water. If we run into an issue where like most of the fencing that needs to be done is border fence and that falls out of NRCS's rules, we've had instances then when we take just the fencing project and make that an RSA project and send the water portion of it to NRCS. We've used every partner involved up here. Fish and Wildlife Service, or Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, has done a ton with these types of projects. Their funding is maybe the most limited. So we've worked to basically kind of leverage that into more projects by combining with other partners' funding. So basically we try to get the biggest bang for the buck by using all of the partnership that exists here, kind of without duplicating effort. So we're spreading as much as far as we can. And then as a group, then basically we're trying to make sure that we have as much knowledge of available programs, options, and expertise that we can get a hold of, trying to make better projects that are more kind of geared for producer friendliness. We wouldn't want there to be certain aspects that would get left out. We try to make very complete projects that way. And usually through the effort of kind of that partnership model, we can add that all together to make kind of more rounded out projects that go a little further for everybody.
I'll jump in there quick, Laura. I see a side conversation going on in chat. I'd love to bring to light with Jeremy, Maestas, and Leo, where that Virginia Tech work surveying landowners shows that once CRP goes out of the current contract and it expires, there's kind of this 3 to 5 year period where landowners are deciding what they want to do. And I think Jeremy's point is huge here, is let's keep green side up first, right? We always go down in the minutia, talking about crested wheat and composition, pulling from a motto I learned from another group, powerful influential landowner group, is the Blackfoot Challenge. And they always go by the 80-20 rule. Let's kind of do the 80% that everybody agrees on. And then if there's answers we don't have, that other 20%, let's figure that out. And so the 80% here is keep this green side up, get it transitioned. And then the 20% where, well, maybe we don't know or we don't agree on the best approach, let's figure that out. But if we have to completely figure out how to solve things like crested composition, we could lose some of those grasslands, which would just be a shame.
Thanks, Dave. We have several more questions coming in here. Again, I want to be respectful of all of our time. We had set our time frame an hour, and we're at an hour and 18 minutes. So maybe we'll ask a couple more questions. If you have one that is just burning that we haven't gotten to, put it in the chat box again, so we can reprioritize it. But let's say we're going to try to wrap up in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So I'll ask a couple more of these questions that I have written, that I have copied and pasted over here. What would you say to someone that wants to return their expiring CRP to crop production instead of grazing? Any thoughts on that? Dave, go ahead. If you want to take that, or Martin, or anyone else there?
Sure, I can take it. So the biggest question there is what we all do, especially at least here, is this is voluntary conservation. So it has to be in that landowner's interest for them to want to do whatever they want to do with it. That's the conservation that matters. So whatever decision they're going to make there, we do our best to try to provide them with basically the most resource friendly way to do that. So in those instances where that soil is just inherently higher quality for cropland, like where Dave said earlier, we're probably going to lose it to crop instead of grassland. That's probably okay. You can't get all of them in the grassland, and I mean there's a lot. We need crops, so there's going to be instances where it makes sense for that to be cropland. I think from my side of it as a partner biologist and someone that works with producers is that producer needs to know their options of what would it take to get it to grazing? What would that look like from a profitability standpoint? What is the farm market situation right now? Like right now, with crops as low as they are, it's kind of hard to lease some of those smaller pieces. So basically making sure that those producers know their options and are able to make a decision that's best for them while still being provided with basically the best conservation way to go forward with that decision, I think is what we really try to focus on here. And a lot of the time, especially here with just the high percentage of marginal soils that we have that have become cropland, those are the ones that, like Dave said, we really try to focus on as ones that will probably actually stay in grassland if they are basically incentivized and set up to be grazable lands. Most of our CRP and converted cropland here was farmed basically due to a lack of grazability. So being able to set up that grazing option, I think, is the huge piece that we really focus on here.
Thanks, Martin. I have two more that I think kind of correlate that I see here in the chat box and earlier. With your monitoring, can you identify carbon capture levels? And then another one was be interesting to see carbon sink underground, root biomass by correlating above ground vegetation. Brady, if you've had a chance to read, those are both a little bit lengthier questions, but I'm curious if you'd have a response to those questions or comments there.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. So to answer the question directly is yes, we do measure carbon capture on rangelands. Specifically, I'm referring to vegetation carbon or photosynthesis, and that's actually the foundation on which our production data is built upon. And we also do measure it above ground and below ground. We measure a total carbon capture. And so, you know, we're thinking about, as carbon becomes more and more important and there's more interest in carbon in the private conservation world, you know, we're thinking about how can we fit that in to the broader perspective and the broader initiatives and landscapes. And so that's something that we've been talking a lot about. And I think in the future, you will see more carbon products and more talk about carbon on the wrap.
And I think a follow-up to that, Brady, it says if markets were to develop for carbon, at least I'm assuming that's what he means by big C, would that increase the appeal of keeping expiring CRP lands in grass and establishing a rangeland grazing system?
You know, I'd have to, you know, I don't know. I'd have to think a little more critically about that and the role of how carbon would play, particularly when you talk about, you know, private landowners and private conservation. As Martin said, this is all voluntary conservation. So it really comes down to what the landowner would want to do. So I think carbon does have a role. It's just right now it's unsure kind of what that role is.
Great. Dave, Martin, any other closing thoughts? I know we didn't get to all of the questions that we had in the chat box, but I hope we covered most of the topics that were asked. We had a lot of really great questions. I hope you guys got time to ask and share some ideas in those breakout groups. So I'm going to let, again, Dave, any closing thoughts that you'd like to share here?
This was a ton of fun tonight. I appreciate everybody's participation, and it's just more evidence of the value of rangelands and conservation to society. Just appreciate it.